This is a kind of revision and combination of two papers that I gave over the past couple of years. One of them in Paris a couple of years ago that was focused on these themes in Nicholas, and then a second one which Jonathan has heard in Ottawa last year that was focused on the more of the patristic and, as I say, possibly neo-Pythagorean background of material in Nicholas. So let's see, just find my document now. But I also, as I did in Paris, I think I'll begin with just a bit of background, which is sort of summarizing material that's in a forthcoming article on Psellos. So I think that helps set the stage, particularly for those who are not familiar with Nicholas. In a well-known article by Gerhard Podskalski, Nicholas of Methone und die Proclus Renaissance in Byzance, Nicholas's refutation served as indirect evidence that the interest in Proclus, so abundantly evident in the works of Michael Psellos in the 11th century, and still detectable beneath the surface in Eustratius of Nicaea in the early 12th century, had in fact persisted into the time of Nicholas, who died around 1166. Surely, the argument goes, such a refutation demonstrates a contemporary fashion for Proclus in Byzantium, for it seems implausible that Nicholas would have gone to such lengths to refute Proclus had he not regarded his influence as a continuing and contemporary problem. Indeed, in his prologue to the Refutation, Nicholas explains that he has chosen to write the work because he observes that the attraction of Proclus for some of his fellow Christians has led them into heresy. For this reason, he has decided to show, chapter by chapter, the points at which Proclus's teaching and Christian doctrine are at odds. However, the absence of direct evidence for any substantial interest in Proclus's works in the mid-12th century in Byzantium might lead one to reconsider the assumption that there was such interest. Might one instead account for Nicholas's concerns primarily by supposing that he was reacting to Psellos's use of Proclus? After all, Psellos's writings circulated widely in the 12th century. Nicholas would not be the first to engage in polemic with a long-departed threat. Cyril of Alexandria, for example, wrote his lengthy treatise against Julian the Apostate more than half a century after Julian's death. In a forthcoming article, I have examined in detail Michael Psellos's use of the Elements of Theology, precisely in order to consider whether the refutation might have been primarily a reaction to the works of Psellos. Among Nicholas's primary concerns, in part announced explicitly in his prologue and in part emerging only later in the Refutation, are to defend the doctrine of the Trinity against Proclus's unitary conception of the first principle, and to distinguish strictly between the intra-Trinitarian generations of the Son and the Spirit from the Father, on the one hand, and the Trinity's creative production of everything else, on the other hand. In Nicholas's view, Proclus's hierarchical emanative structure cannot be applied to the persons of the Trinity, where the Son and the Spirit, although causally derivative, are consubstantial with the Father and thus equally divine. Nor is this emanative structure an adequate way to understand God's production of the world, since it seems to present a causal continuum in which the first principle is not the unique metaphysical cause, utterly distinct from or wholly other than its creative effects. Instead, Proclus's causal continuum involves a series of metaphysical causes that seem to operate in the same manner as the first cause, even if each successive cause is more restricted in scope. Proclus's system is, in Nicholas's view, irredeemably polytheistic, both with its theory of henads and with its descending sequence of hypostases. This point bears emphasizing. The henads are the more obvious polytheistic feature of Proclus's system, but the emanative hierarchy, which we see already in Plotinus, is for Nicholas probably equally problematic, representing as it does a kind of polytheism by its distribution of creative power along a descending series. So, With Nicholas's chief concerns in mind, I studied Psellos' use of Proclus's Elements of Theology in an attempt to discover whether he held a more sympathetic view of these aspects of Proclus's thought than Nicholas did, and thus whether Psellos' writings might help explain why Nicholas wrote his Refutation. Before moving on to my main topic for today, I will summarize my conclusions in regard to Psellos' use of Proclus's elements. First of all, it must be recognized that Psellos uses Proclus's elements in different genres and in different ways. In some texts, he simply quotes or paraphrases him without comment. In others, he quotes passages from Proclus and adds brief comments on the compatibility of Proclus's philosophy with Christian teaching. And in others, most notably in his discussions of Gregory of Nazianzus, he uses Proclus as a hermeneutical tool. I think that this last kind of use of Proclus involves the greatest measure of commitment on Psellos' part to Proclus's philosophy, whereas his compilation of Proclean texts is not necessarily proof of his own commitment to the ideas. Having said that, however, I would add that the large volume of Proclean material in Psellos' compilations, and I'm thinking especially of his De Omnivaria Doctrina, which extensively excerpts the Elements of Theology, this does suggest a deep intellectual investment in Proclus's thought to an extent that I think would probably have troubled Nicholas. Second, if we look at the texts in which Psellos is using Proclus's elements in his interpretation, whether it be a biblical text, a liturgical text, or Gregory the Theologian's orations, we can see a range of ways that Psellos uses Proclus vis-a-vis Christian doctrine. Some of Psellos' citations of the elements are inconsequential. Some are doing real hermeneutical work, but are entirely uncontroversial because they involve principles shared between Christianity and Neoplatonism. And finally, some seem to me to push the bounds of orthodoxy. In this last category, I have in mind specifically several texts in which Psellos speaks of henads without even any acknowledgement that this is contrary to Christian teaching. But even there, I've not reached a firm conclusion. It may be that Psellos is using the term henads in the way that Dionysius did to refer to the angels. So that requires further study. My overall conclusion with regard to Psellos is that while he has a much greater sympathy for Proclus than Nicholas does, it is unlikely that Psellos' use of the Elements of Theology was a sufficient cause for Nicholas to write his Refutation, even though Psellos does seem to push the bounds of what Nicholas would have found doctrinally acceptable. These remarks are based only, I should note, on Psellos' use of the Elements of Theology, and a complete survey of all citations of Proclus, other works of Proclus, in Psellos' works might clarify the picture. We may never have a very full understanding of the circumstances that led Nicholas to expend such time and effort on Proclus, but one obvious place to look for clues is in the other surviving writings of Nicholas. I have found at least one such clue in one of Nicholas's anti-Latin treatises, in a passage where, following Photius, the 9th century patriarch, Nicholas draws a connection between the Filioque and polytheism. Now, it seems highly implausible, of course, that any theologian defending the Filioque would have used Proclus to support his arguments, but it is noteworthy that Nicholas himself sees the two issues as related. It is therefore no accident that, in addition to his 3 treatises against the Filioque, Nicholas also wrote a refutation of Proclus as a polytheistic philosopher. The connecting thread here is the idea of divine monarchy, the monarchia of the Father in relation to Son and Spirit, and the monarchia of the Trinity in relation to creation. So, I'll pause for a moment and put you back on screen where I can see you. That's that much by way of setting the scene with the background of Psellos. Okay, so I turn now to my main endeavor today. namely to elucidate certain systematic features of Nicholas's thought, and thus to show how we can understand him as having a more or less coherent opposing system whose principles largely determine his response to each of Proclus's propositions. Of course, one may say that Nicholas is simply opposing Proclus with Christian doctrine, and this is true. Yet, he does so with his own specific emphases, emphases that are not uniformly shared by other patristic and Byzantine sources. It is these distinctive emphases, or some of them at least, that I would like to highlight today. I gave an earlier version of this paper the title, Nicholas of Methone's Refutation as a Counter Elements, subtitle, Major Themes and Their Systematic Relations. I like this idea of trying to figure out, well, if Proclus has an Elements of Theology, can we extract from Nicholas a kind of counter elements? In other words, what are the sort of fundamental principles that he's opposing to Proclus? Now, there'd be some truth in saying that Nicholas's counter elements is simply the Orthodox Creed. It's a very general shared Christian belief. But there are specific important aspects of Nicholas's response that are not explicable in such generic terms. To some extent, I have already discussed Nicholas's distinctive emphases and strategies on other occasions. For example, in a 2017 article titled Dionysius Against Proclus, I have shown how one of Nicholas's prominent strategies is to invoke Dionysius's emphasis on divine mystery and transcendence as a way of defending the doctrine of the Trinity against Proclus's system with its apparently Unitarian first principle, a system which he regards as an exercise in rationalistic hubris. In the same article, I discuss the complications and ironies that such a Dionysian critique involves, given Dionysius' own significant debt to Proclus's philosophy. So this is an interesting aspect of the dynamic of Nicholas in relation to Proclus and his sources, is that Dionysius is a major authority whom he's recruiting against Proclus. Now, the role of Dionysian apophaticism for Nicholas remains prominent in what I want to present today, but what I wish to focus on are Nicholas's ideas about divine motion and fecundity, or fertility, Greek words γονιμότης. Nicholas signals the importance of these ideas, the particular importance of these ideas, by placing them at the end of his prologue to the Refutation, and this is where we will begin to consider them. The prologue to Nicholas's Refutation, which I have provided in the handout, can be divided into 5 sections. And I've given several excerpts in your handout. In the first section, excerpted in passage 1, Nicholas expresses his astonishment that some of his fellow Christians are fascinated by Proclus and have thereby fallen into heresy. Quote, "For this reason," he announces, "I took care lest many of our contemporaries suffer that fate, as many, that is, as deem worthy of study, the chapters by Proclus of Lycia called Theological Elements. And I knew that I must indicate, after diligently fixing my mind on them, the opinion in each chapter that is contrary to the divine faith, providing also some refutation so as to unmask the elaborate lie that eludes most people, hidden as it is in elegance." So this is what I mentioned a moment ago, that he's referring to people who are his own contemporaries, but he just doesn't tell us who they are. In the second section of the prologue, not on your handout, Nicholas invokes divine aid for his endeavor, contrasting divine wisdom with the foolishness of merely human wisdom in classic Pauline fashion. In the third section, text 2 on your handout, Nicholas develops an elaborate typology according to which Proclus's Elements of Theology is like a new Tower of Babel, with propositions for its bricks and logic for its mortar. I love this metaphor. It very much illustrates the way that Nicholas sees Proclus as a rationalist who is just overreached in trying to understand transcendent realities. In the fourth section, again, not on your handout, Nicholas begins to comment on a few specific features of Proclus's text, beginning with the first proposition, which he regards as an attack on the Christian Trinity. In the fifth and final section, where I want to focus now, Nicholas begins to articulate his response to Proclus. This section merits close attention, for it expresses concisely several of Nicholas's fundamental themes. In your handout, I have divided it into two sections, text 3 and 4. The first subsection introduces the Dionysian aspect of Nicholas's critique, and the second subsection integrates into this Dionysian framework the themes of divine fecundity and self-movement, connecting both these themes to a famous statement by Gregory of Nazianzus' 29th oration. So let's look at text 3 now. Again, this is the Dionysian part. One must know that the things demonstrated by him concerning one and multitude do not at all give offense to us in regard to the doctrine of the highest Trinity, since to speak as does the great Dionysius, that which is worshipped by us is both one and three, and neither one nor three, since it is beyond every one and every multitude, seeing that it is in fact even superior to number, and transcends every word and every concept. For truly, that which is revered would not be beyond us if it were captured by our intellect and reason. Yet it escapes not only our intellect, but even all the supercelestial beings, which are also intellects, since they are also named intellectual substances. So the angels. We confess, therefore, that the divinity is a trinity, and that the same is a monad and the one. Its being three does not negate its being the one, nor does its being the one negate its being three, but rather from both it is confirmed to be both. For it is three, not as being measured by number, but as what gives substance to every three and measures every number. For this reason is not a countable three, so that it could also be called a multitude, but is the one and only Trinity, and not by participation in the one, for such a three is countable and belongs to the same order as the multitude, but as itself being the one. So that's the very Dionysian aspect in this paragraph. Then section 4 introduces a new element. Text 4. Again, it is the one, yet it is not sterile, nor by any means unmoved. Rather, since it itself is the cause of all fecundity and motion, for this reason it is the fecund in itself, and the unique and very first self-moved, lest it be deprived of the best things that are derived from it. For if it is sterile, whence comes fecundity for others? And if it is unmoved, whence comes motion? For otherwise one must grant that something else is the cause of these qualities, and in this case the cause of all things would not be one. But if, on the contrary, the cause of all things is both one and fecund, or fertile, then it must also be self-moved. Because of this, says Gregory the theologian, the monad from the beginning moved toward a dyad, and at the Trinity, or the Triad, came to a halt. Since then, this one is both fecund and self-moved, for this reason it is also three, and since it is three, on account of this it is also one. Or rather, let us say that the unique and supersubstantial three itself is the same as the one itself. The fundamental logic of the passage involves the idea that motion and fecundity are positive features of the created order, that they are among the best things that derive from the one, and therefore that both motion and fecundity are found in a transcendent manner, pre-contained, as it were, in the one itself. This is a vocabulary Nicholas likes to use a lot, this idea of pre-containment. God pre-contains various qualities of the created order. If the one, by what we might call a creative fecundity, brings into being creatures that themselves possess fecundity, then the one itself must possess not only a creative fecundity, but also a natural fecundity, a fecundity internal to itself that is the paradigm of natural, creaturely fecundity, and that is, in fact, the foundation of the creative act itself. Likewise, if the one, by its own creative movement, is the source and cause of creatures that are capable of movement, then it must somehow originate and prefigure this movement by containing motion within itself as self-motion. In the climactic line of the prologue, Nicholas ties together these two ideas, divine fecundity and divine self-motion, with the words of Gregory Nazianzus' 29th oration. Quote, "Because of this, the monad from the beginning moved toward a dyad, and at the Trinity came to a halt." On Nicholas's reading, the divine fecundity that is manifest in the begetting of the Son and the proceeding of the Spirit may be understood as an eternal self-motion, the principle and paradigm of all creaturely motion, and especially of creaturely self-motion. I will return shortly to the particular significance of creaturely self-motion. Whereas Nicholas began the paragraph, text 3, by enlisting Dionysian apophaticism in defense of the Trinity, contending that the Trinity transcends our concepts of oneness and threeness, he ends the paragraph, text 4, with a kind of analogical argument for the Trinity as the transcendent source or paradigm of all created fecundity and motion. Nicholas's appeal to Gregory is situated within a Dionysian dialectic between the apophatic and cataphatic approaches, which always are seen by Nicholas, following Dionysius, as complementary modes of thinking about God in relation to creatures. Not content with employing the apophatic side of this dialectic to preserve a space for the Trinity against the encroachments of what he regards as Proclus's rationalism, Nicholas pairs this negative argument with a positive argument for the superiority of Trinitarian doctrine over what he regards as the sterile pagan alternative, the unmoved monad. The stark contrast between this idea of divine self-motion and Proclus's way of seeing things becomes very clear when one considers Nicholas's comments upon Proposition 14, where Proclus presents a hierarchy in which the unmoved has the highest rank, followed by the self-moved in the middle, this is the level of soul, and the other moved at the bottom, this is the level of body. In your handout, texts 5, 6, and 7, I have provided the portions of Nicholas's commentary on Proposition 14 that concern us. Whereas Proclus, following a long tradition, placed the unmoved at the top of the hierarchy, so going all the way back to Aristotle at least, Nicholas argues that the predicate unmoved does not, strictly speaking, apply to anything that exists. Only what does not exist at all can be described as entirely without movement. Unlike Proclus, who divides reality into the unmoved and the moved, with a further subdivision of the moved into the self-moved and the other moved, heterokiniton, Nicholas instead places the fundamental division between the self-moved, autokiniton, and the other moved, heterokiniton. The category of self-moved is, in the strict sense, applied to the Trinity alone. And thus, the category of other moved, heterokiniton, extends to everything besides God. Everything that God has brought into being and that therefore is other-moved in its origin. Within this latter category of other-moved, Nicholas makes a subordinate division between, the Greek here is ta devteros autokinita, the secondarily self-moved, beings that are self-moved in a secondary sense, namely angels and rational souls, and beings that are exclusively other-moved, namely bodies. Here are his own words, text 5. The entirely unmoved is, according to the precise and true account, that which in no way at all exists. All bodies whatsoever are other-moved, and the bodiless angels are participants in the bodiless substances are participants in the self-motion that we call self-determination, receiving this from the first self-moved and self-subsistent substance, which, according to Gregory the theologian, as monad from the beginning, naturally moved toward a dyad, and at the Trinity came to a halt. So we see that same passage already coming back. This is the passage most frequently cited from Gregory in Nicholas's Refutation. Creatively moving by excess of goodness, this first self-moved substance produces all beings, both those which are self-moved in a relative fashion, ta devteros autokinita, and those which are other-moved. One must in all cases qualify movement in accordance with the things that are moved. Just as one must speak naturally of natural things, so also one must speak supernaturally of supernatural things. End quote. One can detect here the Dionysian way of thinking in this last statement, which emphasizes the relativity or polyvalence of terms relating to motion. Nicholas goes on to criticize Proclus for lacking such nuance, appealing to Aristotle along the way. Text 6. He, Proclus, understands motion without distinction, although this is said in many senses, in various senses. And he understands unmoved without distinction, though this too is said in two ways. Unmoved can be meant as superior to motion and as inferior to motion in the sense of privation. In this way, then, although he wished to beguile through equivocal words, we show that he overturns himself rather than others. Nicholas is here rather unfair to Proclus, who of course was capable of making and grasping fine distinctions, to say the least. Nicholas does avail himself of the two ways that unmoved may be said, for while in this chapter he denies that the first cause is unmoved, in later chapters he's prepared to apply the predicate unmoved to God, provided it be understood in the superior sense. Thus, in chapter 16 he states, this is text 8, and from these things it is clear, in fact, that the divine moves and reverts all things to itself, insofar as it is named the highest object of desire and longing, and moving all things, but moved by nothing else but itself alone, perhaps it alone may be called both unmoved and self-moved. So it turns out that there is a sense for Nicholas, and not only for Proclus, in which God is unmoved, namely that God is not moved by anything else, at least. And of course, for Nicholas, God's proper self-motion has nothing to do with locomotion. But Nicholas has told us that the terms motion and unmoved have more than one meaning, and so we also find that Nicholas sometimes applies the term unmoved to bodies, using the word in a lower sense simply to mean that they cannot move themselves. So using the word unmoved as another way of saying other moved in Proclus's terms. A little later in his comments on Proposition 14, Nicholas summarizes his position again. This is text 7. We confess that the first being, God, is, properly speaking, self-existent and self-moved, It moves and makes and preserves all the other beings, transforming them as it pleases, granting to some, after being other-moved in their creation, also to be self-moved, but assigning to others only to be other-moved. Thus, only the Creator is self-moved in the proper sense. All creatures are fundamentally other-moved, but some creatures are also self-moved in a derivative or qualified sense. Self-motion in a creature is ontologically posterior to the fundamental other motion of its being brought into existence. So I might just pause here and comment that there's a certain frustrating quality to Nicholas's use of terms because, first of all, they obviously don't map onto Proclus's use of terms, but also Nicholas is not consistent with himself. He's happy to use a term in one way in one context, where you would think that a certain usage was entirely ruled out, but then you find that elsewhere he's using the term in another way. So it's not entirely fair. Gregory's famous statement in Oration 29, the monad from the beginning moved toward Dyad and at Trinity came to a halt, or at Triad, is perhaps Nicholas's primary source and inspiration for conceiving of the Trinity in terms of motion. Dionysius, however, is one of the first Christian authors, or perhaps even the first, to associate the term fecundity, γονιμότης, with the Trinity. In Divine Names 1.4, text 9, Dionysius writes, with an allusion to St. Paul's epistle to the Ephesians, that God is hymned, quote, as triad because of the trihypostatic manifestation of the supersubstantial fecundity from which all fatherhood in heaven and on earth is and is named. This text is surely one of Nicholas's chief inspirations, for he, like Dionysius in this passage, not only thinks of the Trinity in terms of fecundity, but he also repeatedly speaks of divine fecundity as the source of creaturely fecundity. Now, Maximus the Confessor seems to be the first patristic writer to have explicitly related Gregory's statement in Oration 29 to the Dionysian theme of divine fecundity. I have discovered, however, that Gregory's statement concerning the movement of the monad to Triad was already brought into Dionysian context before Maximus in the scholia on Dionysius that were written by John of Scythopolis. This is text 10. Commenting on Dionysius's discussion of unions and distinctions within the unutterable union and sustaining source, John writes, he now theologizes concerning the procession of the unspeakable triad to three hypostases, that the God and Father, moving timelessly, beneficently and lovingly, proceeded to a distinction of hypostases, partlessly and without diminishment remaining superunified and supersimplified in his own wholeness, his own radiance proceeding into existence as a living image, and the all-Holy Spirit proceeding from the Father ever flowingly and in a manner worthy of worship, as the Lord mystically teaches. And by goodness, the cause and fount of all things is multiplied to a trihypostatic thearchy. And these things, Gregory the theologian says in his discourses against Eunomius, in other words, in the passage that we've been considering from Oration 29. So while the term γονιμότης, fecundity, does not appear in this passage from John, the idea, at least, is arguably present when John speaks of, quote, the cause and fountain of all things being, quote, multiplied by goodness. Elsewhere, never mind. Maximus the Confessor, in his Ambiguity to John, is the first to offer an interpretation of Gregory's statement that explicitly relates it to divine fecundity. Unlike Nicholas, however, who makes divine self-motion central to his refutation of Proclus, Maximus is anxious to explain away Gregory's apparent claim that God moves. Maximus understands the movement subjectively, as taking place in our progressive understanding of God's triune character. This is text 11. The monad, from the beginning, moved toward Dyad, and at Trinity came to a halt. So just quoting Gregory's line. And then his own interpretation. For it is moved in the intellect receptive to it, whether angelic or human, that through it and in it makes investigations concerning it. And to speak more clearly, he teaches the intellect indivisibly in the first approach, the principle concerning monad, lest division be introduced into the first cause, but spurs it to receive also its divine and unspeakable fecundity, saying to it in a hidden and mysterious manner that it should not consider this good to be ever infertile of word and wisdom or of sanctifying power. That's a bit of an awkward phrase in English. The Greek there is agonon logu kesophias I agiastikis dynameos, infertile of the word, infertile of the power, not bringing forth the word or the power. So, saying that it should not consider this good to be infertile and so forth, of the word and wisdom, which are consubstantial and hypostatic, lest the divine be conceived as composed of these as of accidents, and not be believed to exist eternally as these. To summarize then, it seems that Dionysius was the first theologian to have associated the Trinity with the term fecundity. John of Scythopolis then brought Gregory's text into a Dionysian context, and Maximus made an explicit connection between Trinity and fecundity in his explanation of the same key text from Gregory. Nicholas's actual formulations, however, strongly suggest that he also has John of Damascus in mind, as I will show shortly. Not only in Nicholas's prologue, but throughout his refutation, the theme of divine fecundity is central. In nearly half of his 22 uses of the term γονιμότης, he qualifies it with the adjective physici, natural. His purpose in specifying a natural fecundity, physici γονιμότης, is to emphasize what he regards as a crucial distinction between three kinds of procession, to use Proclus's term. It is noteworthy that Proclus himself uses the term γονιμός, fertile or fecund, to characterize the productive capacities of principles at various levels within his system. But whereas Proclus's emanative doctrine suggests a seamless continuity in the productive procession of the one into being, into life, into intellect, into soul, etc., Nicholas, in contrast, strictly distinguishes between three different processions. So Nicholas is willing to use the term procession, since he's commenting on Proclus, who uses it all the time, prologue, but he's then going to assign it specific distinctions to accord with Christian doctrine. So the fundamental and framing distinction is constituted by the creative procession, God's free and unmediated production of all things from not being, ekmi ontos. This creative procession is never described in terms of natural fecundity, and rarely is the word fecundity used for it at all. Only once, in chapter 151, Nicholas speaks of God's creative capacity as a knowing fecundity, epistemonici γονιμότης, and as a productive fecundity, praktiki γονιμότης. Natural fecundity, however, is strictly distinguished from this creative capacity and designates, in the first place, the Divine Father's role as begetter of the Son and projector of the Spirit, and in the second place, reflections of this begetting and procession within the created order. Whereas the products of the creative procession are different in species from their cause, creatures are different in species from God, the characteristic feature of natural fecundity is that it brings about offspring that are of the same species and nature. So God begets God, and humans beget humans. Nicholas's specification of natural fecundity, Physique γονιμότης, exhibits a clear affinity with John of Damascus, for in his De Fide Orthodoxa, he writes, "It is impossible to say that God is lacking in the natural fecundity. And fecundity is to beget from oneself or from one's own offspring, from one's own substance, offspring similar to oneself in nature." In another text, John further specifies this notion. Text 13. Christ the truth says, "The sower went out to sow." And who is the sower? God and Father and Creator and Farmer. God according to nature, Father according to the natural fecundity, by which he is father of a son and projector of a spirit. Creator, for by will he framed this universe from not being. Farmer, for from his supersubstantial existence, he cultivates each of the things that come into being, distributing the substantial grace and power that are analogous and appropriate to the nature of each, as well as the persistence and stability of their natural state. In the latter text from John, we see not only the specification of natural fecundity that is typical in Nicholas, but also the explicit identification of this fecundity with both the begetting of the Son and the projecting of the Spirit, what Nicholas will designate as the twofold mode of natural fecundity. Ton viton tropon tis physicis γονιμότητος. Thus, in responding to Proclus's proposition 64, Nicholas writes, this is text 14, "It is not the case that many self-perfect henads, or monads, proceeded from the one and only and all-perfect Father, but only two, according to the twofold mode of natural fecundity, the one and only Son, by begetting, and the one and only Holy Spirit, by proceeding." So I think this is a very interesting passage. You have this system of henads in Proclus, and in Proposition 64, Proclus is talking about self-perfect henads, and Nicholas is quite explicit. No, there's only two. If you want to talk about self-perfect henads, there's only two, and it's the Son and the Spirit. Later, when commenting on Proposition 151, this is text 15, Nicholas uses the same phrase, but with an addition. The one is fecund by nature and begets the Son, not simply similar to itself and equal in nature, but supernaturally and ineffably from its own substance and nature, and brings forth likewise the Spirit, according to the twofold mode of natural fecundity beheld also among us. And thus the superprincipal monad, superprincipially moving, came to a halt in Trinity, and the same is both monad and triad. Nicholas's phrase that I'm focusing on here, the twofold mode of natural fecundity beheld also among us, is puzzling at first sight. One might ask, what mode of fecundity do creatures have besides begetting? What is he talking about? But the meaning becomes clear in chapter 18 of the Refutation, where Nicholas takes the fountain and the Son to serve as images of the projection of the Spirit. Text 16, quote, "Although the Father is hypostatic cause, hypostatikon option, of both the Son and the Spirit, he is not the productive or creative cause, but rather he is the begetting cause of the former and the bringer forth or projecting cause of the latter, as Father and projector. And everything that thus begets and brings forth according to its own nature, begets and brings forth something similar to itself. And so a man begets a man, and a horse begets a horse, and a fountain gushes forth water, and the sun gives forth light with its ray, and these begotten and projected things are similar to what begot or brought them forth. Thus, for Nicholas, the divine fecundity that is distinctly expressed in both the begetting of the Son and the projecting of the Spirit is also reflected in a twofold manner within the created order. So you have men and horses as a kind of image of begetting of the Son, and then things like fountain and light as an image of the projection of the Spirit, or a reflection. Let us now return to the theme of divine self-motion. Just as God's natural fecundity is reflected in the natural fecundity of creatures, so also, according to Nicholas, divine self-motion, autokinesia, is reflected in the motion of creatures, and preeminently in the self-motion of angelic minds and rational souls. Of course, the association of self-motion with soul is an old one going back to Plato. Precisely this association is what we see in the hierarchy that Proclus outlines in Proposition 14. Nicholas, however, on the one hand, extends the application of self-motion beyond the level of soul so as to include also angelic intellects and the One, i.e. the Trinity. And on the other hand, he restricts the meaning of self-movement so that only rational souls, not all souls, are self-moved. This restriction is made clear by his consistent association of self-movement with self-determination, auftexousiotitos. For example, in his commentary on Proposition 14, which we have already considered, this was back in text 5, he states that, quote, the bodiless substances are participants in the self-motion that we call self-determination, receiving this from the first self-moved and self-subsistent substance. In other texts, Nicholas assigns self-determination, auftexousiotis, to the rational soul and the supercosmic intellects, that's chapter 19, or to rational intellectual beings that are governed by nature and by choice, that's chapter 43. And he had other passages as well where he associates self-movement and self-determination. And he makes clear that self-determination is the power of choosing freely between moral alternatives. So, for example, God can be free of blame because he gave us self-determination. So if we do evil, God didn't do it, we did it. It's that kind of power. In chapter 185, he again identifies self-movement and self-determination, saying, the soul is agreed to be self-determined, or at any rate, the soul that is called rational, according to which especially it is self-moved. That's a bit confusing, the phrasing. In other words, it's designated as self-moved with respect to its rationality in particular. In chapter 186, he speaks of the animal that, quote, is rational and because of this, free and self-determined to do that which indeed it might wish, not being governed by nature alone as the irrational animals are. There's nothing novel in this meaning of self-determination, which could be illustrated from many patristic sources. And a helpful book in particular on this is Michael Freda's book, A Free Will, which discusses some of those developments. Both in prior authors and in Nicholas, auftexousios typically applies only to angels and men rather than to God. But although on one occasion, in one of his anti-Latin treatises, Nicholas does speak of the Holy Spirit as auftexousios, self-determined. Thus, autokinitos, self-moved, and auftexousios, self-determined, are not strictly interchangeable for Nicholas, since he more readily speaks of God as self-moved than as self-determined. Even so, the two terms are very closely associated for Nicholas. This is unusual, and as I've already noted, Nicholas's understanding of self-moved in terms of self-determination is a restriction of the traditional sense of self-motion as a characteristic of soul in a broader sense. When we look into the sources for precedents for Nicholas's usage, a familiar pattern emerges. In two passages of Gregory of Nazianzus, again, texts 17 and 18, we find the terms αυτοκίνητος and αυτοεξουσιος in close proximity in lists of attributes of the Son and the Holy Spirit. And John of Scythopolis, again, in two scholia on Dionysius on the divine names, glosses self-moved as meaning self-determined, explicitly excluding the more generic sense of motion. Text 20, we should understand that by self-moving, he, Dionysius, means those endowed with self-determination and those who rule themselves. He does not mean things that move themselves, such as animate beings, in opposition to immobile things, such as houses and mountains. Gregory and Dionysius are Nicholas's two most important sources in his refutation of Proclus, and we've already seen how Nicholas also seems to be influenced by John of Scythopolis' scholia on Dionysius. It therefore seems quite likely that his somewhat idiosyncratic understanding of self-motion, that is, his conception of self-motion in terms of rational self-determination, is rooted in these earlier passages of Gregory Nazianzus and John of Scythopolis. What appears to me to be entirely unprecedented in Nicholas's refutation is that he not only ascribes self-movement to God, but he specifically associates self-movement with God as Trinity, and interprets Gregory's famous line, the monad moved to dyad and at triad came to a halt, in these terms. Unlike Maximus the Confessor, who in his interpretation of this passage, as we saw, takes pains to deny that God moves, Nicholas emphatically affirms that God is self-moved or self-moving. Given that Nicholas all but identifies self-movement with self-determination, by affirming divine self-motion, he thereby maintains the divine freedom, and with it, by extension, the freedom of rational souls made in God's image. The logic is as follows. God as Trinity is paradigmatic self-motion, which is paradigmatic self-determination or freedom. All creatures are most basically other-moved, and therefore not free, yet some creatures, namely men and angels, human beings and angels, are given a measure of self-motion, self-determination, freedom. For human beings, this is part of what it means to be made in the image of God. And thus, it follows that human freedom is an image of that divine freedom that is the Trinity. For the remainder of what I'll say, I'll be working more from outline and the passages to draw a few connections. And there's two main things I want to do. One is to discuss this notion of freedom in divine creation, in contrast to the Proclean notion, which came up in Jonathan's talk last time, this notion of production by mere being, autoto enai. And I think there's an interesting contrast to be drawn between Nicholas and Philoponus in regard to related arguments there. And the other is to talk very briefly, at least, about perhaps some of the background of this line in Gregory. So, connection I want to draw here is the way that Nicholas wants to contrast the Christian conception of a free creation, God creating freely, creation by divine will, with Proclus's conception of production by mere being. So let's start with the texts 23 and 24, and then I'll discuss them a little. So Proclus says, everything that comes to be from an unmoved cause has an unchangeable existence. Everything that comes to be from a moving cause has a changeable existence. For if the maker is entirely unmoved, then it produces what is second after it, not through motion, but by mere being. Autoto enai paragi. And if this is so, then it has what derives from it concurrent with its own being. And if this is so, then so long as it exists, it produces. But it always exists, and so it always causes what is after it to subsist. This implies that the latter is always coming into being from it and always exists, attaching its own always according to procession to the maker's always according to activity. This is the one point where the content of the Elements of Theology most closely overlaps with the content of the treatises, the arguments for the eternity of the world, as you can see pretty clearly here. And in particular, the logic of Proposition 76 is closely related to the fourth argument for the eternity of the world. And I've had sort of as a running question, I've wondered whether we can discern any influence one way or another from Philoponus on Nicholas, since Philoponus is the most notable earlier example of a refutation of Proclus. And I'm not sure we can, but this is a place to look, certainly, since the subject matter is overlapping. So now let's look at text 24, part of Nicholas's response here. And note right away the strong apophaticism at the start. That whose being is incomprehensible, of this the power and activity are also incomprehensible, so that both the creation and its manner are incomprehensible. Foolish is he who investigates the how, and who tries to subject this to demonstration. But that the divine is incomprehensible is agreed upon by all. We should therefore attribute the manner of the creation and the persistence or change of things that have come into being or have been created to the purpose of the Creator, who defines according to his will the manner of the creation, the measures of its persistence, and the order and change into one another of the things made. But Proclus, rejecting the divine will and determining by the mere existence of the Creator the production of what comes into being, seems to introduce the creation as involuntary for the Creator. For this reason, furthermore, he does not call it creation, but production. And God produces nothing among beings by mere being, that is, without willing, so as to have his product concurrent with his own being. But all things are posterior to his unoriginate existence. Only his begetting of the Son and projecting of the Spirit is by mere being. And for this reason, these are co-originate and co-internal, so forth. So we see here that this conception of causation by mere being is unacceptable for Nicholas. And just as earlier he said, well, there's only two self-perfect henads, and that's the Son and the Spirit. You could take this aspect of Proclus's language and apply it to the Trinity. Here again, I'll say, well, there is production by mere being, but that's only in the Trinity. And so you could say one reason for rejecting this is that he wants to reserve that kind of language for the Trinity, so we won't talk about the creation. Obviously, another reason is that he's not explicit here, but he doesn't think the world has always existed. And so we need to have another way of conceiving of the production. Now, given all that I've said about self-motion, what interests me here is that I think he's responding to Proclus's argument for the eternity of the world in a somewhat different way from Philoponus. So what I've sent, I worked this up last night. I was looking more closely at Proclus's fourth argument for the eternity of the world. And I tried to sort of distill the argument. Sometimes those arguments are a bit repetitious and the logic is not entirely clear. Trying to just distill the argument and then compare the responses of Philoponus and Nicholas to the argument. I've presented as a kind of proposition and proof as though it were in the elements. So proposition, the cosmos is everlasting because its cause is unmoved and unchanging. Proof, this is now my paraphrase. To shift from not making to making is to change, and to change is to be moved. Therefore, if the cosmos is not eternal but was made, then the maker did not remain unchanged and unmoved. If, however, the maker is unmoved and unchanged, then it does not shift from not making to making, but produces either always or never. Right. Produces either always or never. So if it produces the cosmos, it does so without changing, producing by its mere being. That same phrase we had in Proposition 76. But the maker is indeed unmoved, for to say that the maker changes would be to say it needs time, which is its inferior, and would be to say that it is sometimes incomplete, since motion is incomplete actuality. But both suppositions show great disrespect to the cause of all. Since the first cause is perfect, and as all agree in need of nothing, it is therefore unmoved. Since it is unmoved, it is therefore unchanged. Since it does not change, it does not shift from not making to making. Since it does not shift from not making to making, it produces by its mere being. Since it produces by mere being, its product, the cosmos, exists whenever the cause exists. But the cause is eternal, and so the world is too. And then I've condensed it even further in the form of premises. If the world is not everlasting, then God shifts from not making to making. If God shifts from not making to making, then God changes and moves, but God does not change or move, therefore the world is everlasting, and God produces it by his mere being. So then I try and compare briefly the responses of Philoponus and Nicholas. So they both deny that the world is everlasting, and they deny that God produces by his mere being. So they both want to affirm the divine will. But note this contrast. Philoponus agrees with Proclus that God is unmoved, and he rejects the conclusion by denying the premise that making a non-eternal world involves a change on God's part. So Philoponus denies premise 2. And I don't get into how he does that, but it has to do with distinguishing between the two senses of actuality, first and second actuality, in Aristotelian terms, and saying that since God's making is second actuality, it doesn't involve a change. So it's an interesting argument that Philoponus has there. But the point I want to make right now is that Nicholas, actually, I'm connecting what's implicit in Nicholas. So it's not that Nicholas is explicit here, but it seems to me that the force of his emphases is not to deny premise 2, but to deny premise 3. And to say, actually, God is not unmoved. He's quite explicit about that. God has the self-motion that is freedom, or the freedom of self-motion, and freely produces a non-eternal world. So I thought it was interesting to compare Philoponus and Nicholas here. I'm not sure what to do with it then, because I think Nicholas's position is hard to understand, probably not coherent. I don't know what, it becomes very fuzzy. What does it mean to say God is, in what sense is God self-moved? In what sense does this solve the problem? In what sense is he still unmoved? Because it's pretty clear that Nicholas does grant a sense in which God is unmoved. And if you grant that sense, then are you really denying premise 3? But at least rhetorically, he's denying premise 3. He's denying that God does not move. So for now, I throw that out there. I haven't really tied that together even in my own mind. And then I want to move to, briefly now, Gregory's own use, Gregory of Nazianzus' line that we've come back to so many times already. This is passage 25 on your handout, and a related passage 26. And then we'll probably not get beyond passage 27, which is sort of my most interesting sort of proof text for maybe neo-Pythagorean influence on Gregory. So let's jump into passage 25. We don't need to read the whole thing, although it's very interesting to read. But in the middle, you see I've put in bold the line that Nicholas quotes. Because of this, the monad moved from the beginning to dyad and came to halt the triad. Now, note that the phrase "because of this" which Nicholas was quoting, is actually in the source. It's in Gregory. And so if we ask, because of what is he relating it to in what he's just said? Well, we have to get a bit into the context. So he's talking about monarchy. Christians have this problem, right, of trying to maintain a monarchy with a trinity, and how do you do that? So he's dealing with this problem. I won't read the whole thing, but I'll start with where you see the numeral 2. Monarchy is what is honored by us, not the monarchy that one person circumscribes, but the monarchy that is established by equal honor of nature, by agreement of opinion, by identity of motion, and by the tendency toward the one of those that derive from it, so forth. Okay, so the because of this serves as a linking phrase because he's about to justify, or rather he's about to show a consequence, a logical consequence of what he's just said. Because of this kind of monarchy that he's just described, the monad moved from the beginning to dyad and came to a halt at triad. And then he goes on, note the language carefully. And this is for us, the Father and the Son and the Holy Spirit, the first begetter and projector impassibly, without time or body, the others, namely the Son and the Spirit, begotten, the begotten one and the projection, and so forth. And at the end, I won't read it, but there's a interesting reference to Plotinus where Gregory is objecting to a Plotinian metaphor. So what I want to call your attention to is that after this phrase came to a halt at triad, Gregory says this is for us. Father Andrew Louth put me onto this. I don't think I would have noticed this, but he suggests, I think quite reasonably, that the little phrase for us, tuto imin, shows us that actually Gregory is not making up this line. He's appropriating something from elsewhere. So it's as though he has a Christian Trinitarian discourse, which is his context, and in the midst of that, he's going to say, and this is for us, by the way, what those neo-Pythagoreans are saying. This is now my suggestion. This is for us, the Trinity. The monad moved to dyad, came to rest in triad. This is for us, the Trinity. The implication being, it wasn't necessarily that for the person who said it first before me, but for us, it's the Trinity. Okay, so that's text 25. There's a parallel text, 26, which I won't take the time to read now, but you'll see it's obviously parallel. It has an additional element of matter and form in relation to the dyad, which clearly has philosophical precedence. But then I want to conclude briefly with this fragment from Eunapius. This is text 27. Note what Eunapius says. So Eunapius, I don't know a lot about him. He writes Lives of the Philosophers. He writes some historical works. But let's jump in. Receiving this, so I can't even tell you the context. I'd have to look into this more. It's a historical description. Receiving this one as an ally, he kept him by his side, and then another was added, and there was a multitude. And just as, according to the Pythagoreans, a monad, when it is moved to dyad, is no longer deprived of the nature of numbers, but is dispersed and flows into many. In this way, when Charieto took up Cercio, their achievements increased and the number of their allies grew in proportion to their achievements. So the context is quite historical, and it's kind of an abstruse reference to explain what was going on historically. But I think it's quite a striking illustration of how this kind of language of movement of monads to dyads is regarded as Pythagorean. There's other texts to look at, but this is sort of the most striking example I've found. And then what's perhaps makes it all the more exciting, well, Eunapius is a student of a teacher in Athens named Prohairesius, who was also a teacher of Gregory of Nazianzus. So there you go. That's basically all I have, and I've used up most of my time, but I would be delighted to hear thoughts, questions, reactions.